Good morning, everyone, and thank you. My name is Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Center for American Progress. On behalf of Larry Michel, the President of the Economic Policy Institute, John Podesta, CEO here at CAP, and all of our CAP and EPI colleagues, it is our pleasure to welcome you today to the discussion. We are truly honored to have here at CAP and EPI Vice President Joe Biden in his role as chair of the White House Task Force on Middle-Class Working Families. Vice President Biden will lead today's discussion with a panel of scholars on the longer-term economic trends affecting American workers and their families. And while the Vice President will introduce the full panel, I must just say how personally proud I am to welcome back to the Center my friend and CAP alumna, the President and Vice President's superb domestic policy advisor, Melody Barn. Last summer, then Senator Obama searched for a vice presidential running mate who was someone who, quote, always put the dreams of working people first, unquote. No surprise, then, that Senator Joe Biden was Senator Obama's choice. Long before the Great Recession, then Senator Joe Biden made it his cause to fight for American families who are living on the edge. He saw early on that while rising productivity was enriching some, the vast majority of America's families were struggling to cover rising costs with stagnant wages. Working women and men struggled to balance their responsibilities to employer and family. The U.S. Senator who took the Amtrak to work each day and cared for 2 boys after the death of his wife understood far better than many in Washington the aspiration of America's families for simple things: good work, good health, a chance to save, and a fair shot at running a business, buying a home, and educating their children to get ahead. And he fought for decades to make those dreams a reality. Now, no greater challenge confronts this fighter than what we will discuss here today. While this administration inherited an economy in ruins, President Obama and Vice President Biden have embraced their responsibility for leaving behind a new economic foundation for working families. They aim to repair the damage of our recent economic storm, but also to construct a sounder footing for economic opportunity for working families. Today's discussion with the experts is intended to lay the groundwork for the important policy recommendations of the White House Task Force that the Vice President leads. So please join me once again in welcoming warmly Vice President Joe Biden.
Sarah, thank you very much, and I want to thank the Center for having us here today. I'm going to introduce the panel in my statement here, but I also want to thank, I see 2 people in the audience who are actually sort of the spark plug for this outfit, the Middle Class Task Force being put in place, Andy Stern and Anna Berger. I want to thank them for their continued push and involvement, and as well as a number of other people. I'm not going to go through the list, but this is, I consider this, to state the obvious, really important work. When President Obama established the Middle Class Task Force, he asked me to chair it, and I had one goal in mind, and that is to ensure that as we move through this Great Recession, and we will come out of it, and we will come out of it strong, that the middle class is not positioned in this new recovery like they were in the last 2 economic bubbles that produced economic growth. They were left behind before. We want to make sure they are in the deal. They're in the deal. And to make it possible for everyone who aspires to the middle class to have a fighting chance to get there, and those who are there, be able to stay there. That's the goal of this task force. That's the goal of this administration. It's a goal born out of a historically unique experience by middle-class households in recent years. It's difficulties that, as many of you know well, that started long before this Great Recession. Poor Ralph Whitehead and I, he's been my buddy for now 20-some years, and I don't know how many times we've sat and I've asked for his help as a senator to try to deal with this obvious discrepancy. It's been, I've spent 37 years in the United States Senate as vice president, and Senator Obama was a community organizer, a state senator, now a United States senator, president of the United States. So it's not like all of a sudden this recession, it all dawned on us that, my goodness, the middle class is struggling. It was something we were fully aware of, and one of the reasons, I think, in my discussions with the president, one of the reasons that moved him to get involved in the first place in public life. And it's the reason why I suspect most of you are engaged. We've seen countless families getting crushed by medical bills. We've seen American manufacturing, once the lifeblood of the American economy, gradually eroding as a means by which you could live a middle-class existence. We've seen men and women in big cities and small towns working longer and longer hours, working harder, yet finding it increasingly difficult to afford a decent home and a decent neighborhood, to pay for the kids to go to college, to save for their retirement, and now, in this baby boom generation, take care of their parents at the same time. Again, this is not because of the recession. It's been aggravated mightily by the recession. But this has been something that Melody, when she worked for Senator Kennedy all those years, and I and anybody else involved have been talking about now for the last 15 years, maybe longer. We've seen a family that could once get by with one wage earner in a middle-class neighborhood like the one I grew up in, now requires two wage earners just to stay in the same neighborhood, the same home. So there's kind of an illusion out there. The illusion is that, middle class is getting stronger and better, but the truth of the matter is, and Ralph and I have talked about this a lot, the neighborhood I grew up in, Mayfield it was called, split-level homes and new development, a lovely neighborhood, I guess about 3,000 square feet. The homes cost back in those days $15,000 when my dad moved in the mid-50s. They now cost probably 190, 200, maybe a little more than that. But, you used to be able to live there with one wage earner. And now two wage earners are struggling to stay in this. It's still a decent, lovely neighborhood. But it takes two paychecks to stay there. So right after taking office, realizing all these things, the president asked me to take over this middle-class task force to ensure that White House policy equals middle-class policy, that they're not left out of the equation. As the president says often, and Melanie repeats and I repeat, is that, a significant growth in the GDP is necessary but not sufficient to ensure that the folks we're talking about today actually have a fighting chance. I keep quoting my dad. I know, I apologize. But my dad used to say, look, I don't expect the government to solve my problem, but I do expect them to understand my problem. Just understand the problems, half of it. And that's part of the reason why we're here today. As chair of the task force, I meet with the cabinet secretaries, and it's a great privilege the president has given me to convene the cabinet whenever I see fit, and they surprisingly all show up. But all kidding aside, what we do, as Melanie can tell you, is I have tasked the cabinet secretaries. I said, look, I want you to go scrub your entire agency, whether it's Treasury or HUD or education. What are the things we can do? What are the things, when this first term of this administration is finished, that have come out of each of your departments that actually impact on the living standards of those aspiring and those who are in the middle class? So that this task force, with outside advisors, we've traveled through communities throughout the country, hearing from Americans directly about what's on their minds. Let me tell you something that I've known, and most of you have known since you've been taking a look at this issue. Defining the existence of a middle class, defining what it is a difficult undertaking. But I can tell you what it's not. It's not just a paycheck. It's about a quality of life. Ralph has heard me say for years that my definition, which is clearly not an economist's definition, is any family that can't afford to go without two paychecks in a row, without finding themselves really up against it with real difficult choices they have to make. And right now, a middle-class life is much more fragile than it needs to be or it should be. Folks are finding their health coverage is being shifted more and more. The cost is being shifted their ways, if they haven't. That their pensions, once a source of security, are no longer guaranteed pensions. That there are now a considerable source of worry. And aggravated on top of all of that is this recession, where their 401ks have been decimated and where the equity in their home has been wiped out. The very things they relied upon as giving them a sense of security that it's going to be okay when I retire. A home might be affordable, but in a neighborhood with a school district that you don't want to send your kids to. Does that allow you to live a middle-class existence? You have a nice home, roof over your head, but a school that you're convinced your child's not going to be able to learn well enough. Is a family's medical leave something that is critical to them? Does that go to the issue of whether or not they have a quality of life consistent with what their sense of a middle-class existence is? Can you take care of your elderly parents and at the same time send your kids to college? I, like many of you, my mom, who still runs the show, she's 92 years old. She lives with me. She won't move to Washington, but she lives in my home back in Wilmington. Fortunately, I have brothers who've done well and a sister who's done well. But among us, I mean, the cost of just taking care of mom, even living in my own home, is if I were, it's a heck of a burden for a family. And not a burden because I have such help from my brothers and sisters, but not everybody has that. What good is a six-figure paycheck if you can't spend any time with your family? Because you're commuting an excessive amount in order for them to be able to live in a place where you think it's okay. I know these things are not purely economic questions, but I think, at least the neighborhood I come from, where I grew up, they go to the heart of whether or not you measure yourself as having some sense of security, certainty, and it's all about, as I said, it's a lot more than about a paycheck. It's about your quality of life. A job is an important thing, but pay is an important piece of a middle-class existence, but there's so much more to it. And that's what I hope we're going to talk a little bit more about today. And we want to make it all available to those Americans who want it, who want to go out there and just have a shot at living this life. So we kind of took our show on the road here the first 8 months of this administration. I went to St. Louis. We talked about providing greater college access. It was a really good meeting. I mean, we actually had, one of the things was kind of reassuring. There was a woman who stood up and told her story, and on the spot, I felt like Dr. Phil or something. I mean, on the spot, because of the people we had there, we were able to literally that day get her in college. That day. And opened up vistas and horizons for her. And you could see the visible relief. She was trying to make a transition from a part-time job that kept getting cut without the skill. So we went from there, we went to Denver to talk about creating green job opportunities. These are the jobs, with God willing, if we're correct, they're going to be jobs that are solid jobs. The studies show, and the economists can tell you better than I can, that they pay better than comparable jobs that aren't green jobs. And they have an advantage of not being as susceptible to being exported. And it's an industry, an economy that can grow. It's a place we should be looking. We spent time out there listening to everyone from veterans organizations coming back, trying to figure out how to get veterans into these green jobs. Where should we be investing in new technology? What should we be doing? It was a fascinating trip. We then went to Toledo, Ohio, formerly the glass capital of the world, now a struggling town, to talk about revitalizing manufacturing, not revitalizing the old manufacturing base, but a new manufacturing, new technology, moving from manufacturing plate glass to solar panels. I mean, people are ready. I think they're excited, and I think there's things we can actually do to jumpstart a lot of this. We went to Silver Spring, Maryland, to Leisure World, to make sure that Medicare would be as effective and available in meeting the needs of the elderly in the future as it has been in the past. Not an easy, not a certainty without us paying a great deal of attention to it. And this morning we're going to change it up a little. We're going to have a discussion with people who've devoted their attention and their academic interest and their sharp minds to studying and analyzing middle-class issues for a living. we're going to take a step back and we're going to take a broader look at the challenges confronting middle-class families. So I want to introduce the panelists now. There's Heather Boushey from the Center for American Progress, who has been building a very important case on how changes in the job market have affected American families across the income scale. Most recently, Heather's been looking at the increasing contribution of women's earnings to family income, and her work on women as the family breadwinner, or the co-breadwinner, presents an important dimension of the challenges facing middle-class families and brings into focus a whole set of issues that weren't required to be looked at as closely. Ralph Whitehead from the University of Massachusetts has made extremely important contributions to our national debate over these issues regarding middle class and living standards. Ralph's historical roots, his understanding of the evolving aspirations and progress of the American middle class enabled him to be a very early observer of the difficult challenge that started to build for these very families over the past decades. Ralph, and that's what Ralph and I grabbed Ralph, a friend of ours named John Martillo, 20 years ago, Ralph? You were writing it 25 years ago. God, you're getting old. I don't know what the hell, you know. But, and Jim Kessler, who I think has done some really great stuff. I really mean it. Jim has written and thought extensively about new economic rules for middle-class families in the 21st century. Well, that sounds pretty heady, but as Vice President of Policy and co-founder of Third Way, which is among leaders in Washington in developing new policy framework to address the challenges facing today's middle class, and they helped develop an ambitious, what they call a success agenda, if I'm not mistaken, for the middle class that spans college affordability, securing comfortable retirement, starting a business, balancing work and home life, and generally how they're able to get ahead. We're going to talk about what he refers to as the donut hole, because the tendency is for us to think about the middle class and what the median income is, and that's it. But there's an awful lot of people out there. The people really struggling are those people below and at the median income. There's a lot of people in your union, for example, Andy, who husband and wife make what would have thought when we were growing up a really decent wage. But they're having real trouble living a middle-class life, as I think most people have come to think of it. And despite working for Senator Schumer all these years, Jim remains a committed Phillies fan and is in mourning with my wife this morning. So, but Jim, thanks for being here anyway. I appreciate it. And Larry Michel from the Economic Policy Institute, a co-host of this event, has been teaching us about the wage productivity split for well over a decade. The simple metric is now firmly embedded as one of the most revealing indicators of discontent between growth and living standards that is at the heart of this squeeze. And Melody Barnes, the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, is one of the most influential and brilliant people we have in this administration. And I first got to know her, as I referenced earlier, when she served 8 years as the chief counsel for Senator Ted Kennedy in the Judiciary Committee. And after she left the Senate, she was your colleague here, as I mentioned already, at the Center for American Progress. I know she's thrilled to be back, but let me make something very clear. She's not coming back. Right? You're not coming back. You leave, I leave. So Melody is a passionate advocate for middle class and aspiring middle class families, and I'm delighted she's able to be here, and it's such a pleasure to work with her. Look, we all bring a different perspective. Everyone in this panel and everyone in the audience, I suspect, a different perspective. But one thing we all know is the middle class has been dealt out of the American dream for too long. It's a receding dream. Still there, but it's a receding dream. We know that during the last economic expansion between 2000 and 2007, our productivity of our labor force grew by 19%. And yet median income wage earners, the working class, working age households, actually, their income fell. It fell around $2,000. We know that even after years of economic expansion, the share of Americans, and Larry's done so much in this area, of Americans living in poverty was higher in 2007 than it was in 2000. In fact, as I know Larry and EPI team are going to talk about, Larry will talk about a study for years, income concentration measures the share of income going to the top 1% of the households was higher in 2007, 23.5%. Was higher in 2007 than any year on record going back to 1913, with one exception. It was even higher in 1928. That was the year, of course, at the height of another speculative bubble right before the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. So look, it's obvious what's happened over the past, at least the last decade, I would argue longer. If the economy is growing, but middle class and low income families are falling behind, then prosperity must be accruing at the very top of the scale. Quite simply put, the middle class families weren't sharing and haven't been sharing in the wealth that they helped create, at least sharing sufficiently, in my view. Now look, this is not about income redistribution. Some of the folks in the audience all of a sudden don't look and say, we're not talking about income redistribution. We're talking about a fighting chance to make a decent income. And it's about competition, it's about compensation, and it's about fairness. It's about simple fairness. It's about an equality of opportunity. At least that's what we're searching for. We're searching for that holy grail. How do we establish that floor, that level playing field? The dynamic where the economy is moving forward as the middle class is falling back, that's not just, that just doesn't work in the eyes of me and the President and Melanie administration, and it surely is not working for millions of families who are finding the system to be working against them rather than for them. And it doesn't work but the point is it doesn't work for any of us. It doesn't even work for the people who are at the top end of that scale in the long run. The truth of the matter is what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to lift the middle class up just because it's the, quote, right thing to do. We simply can't compete in this global economy, in this flat world, without a strong and growing middle class. It can't be sustained. And so we're doing everything we can to deal with the crisis that hit us the second we lowered our hands. On January 20th, when we dropped our hands after taking the oath, we entered a world of reality that we knew we were entering, but that was that hole was pretty deep. I think we're making progress. I know we're making progress. Our actions have helped pull the economy back from the brink of this abyss to keep the recession from morphing into a depression. But we know we have to think beyond this recession. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. We are extremely happy that the GDP grew 3.5% last quarter instead of the 6-point-something% minus GDP the day when we lowered our hands. They announced that's what it was. So we're making progress. But like I've been saying for a long time, the GDP cannot by itself loosen the middle class squeeze. It's a necessary but not sufficient precondition to full recovery. It's necessary but not sufficient. For that, you need to create job opportunities. You need smart investments in growing sectors like green technologies, smart grid, high-speed rail. You need unions. You need unions to provide more American workers with the bargaining clout they need to reclaim their share of the economic growth. You need investments in college affordability to promote mobility across the single greatest ticket that's available to the middle class, a good education, and increasingly more a college education, or at least a post-high school education. In fact, I'm looking to this panel to help explain what's gone wrong and what's gone right for middle-class families in recent years. So I've asked them to apply their somewhat frightening brain power to help me and the task force get the best diagnosis we can of the challenges we're facing so we can come up with the best prescriptions as to how to deal with it. Because you can't fix it if you don't understand why it's broke. And until we figure that out, we're not going to stop till we fix it. Not until the American dream, which sounds trite to use that phrase, but it's literal, until the American dream is viewed by most people to be back within their grasp. Let me end by saying that on a somewhat personal note, as I said, we all come with this from a slightly different perspective. It used to be, at least the perception I had growing up, in a family that did fine. It was a typical middle class. My dad struggled. He worked a long time, worked long hours without a college education, and he applied himself. And but there was always a sense he had the absolute there was an absolute certitude that he had that his kids were going to do better than he would. I mean, it wasn't even there. I mean, there was. I remember he used to say to me, "Joey, you're going to get a college education because they can never take it away from you." And I'm wondering, what in the God's name are you talking about? Take away? I mean, what good's a college education if you don't have a job? But to my father, and I think his whole generation, there was this sense, an absolute certitude that things were going to be better for his kids. Opportunities were going to be better. This sounds trite, and I know I am at heart a politician, which I'm proud of. But look, folks, ask yourself, how many people in my dad's circumstance in the year 2009 really believe in their hearts that their kid's going to get a better shot than they got? You know, you only heard me say this before. The longest walk a mother or father can make is up a short flight of stairs into their kid's bedroom to say, "Honey, I'm sorry. You can't go back to St. Mary's or Cooper School, or you can't play in that same team. You can't, Dad lost his job, Mom lost her job. Or, you know, we can't keep the house, honey. The bank said we just can't keep the house." That's a hell of a long walk. An awful lot of Americans have made that walk recently. My dad made that walk when I was going into 4th grade in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Like millions of people, no Horatio Alger story. But he made that walk, and I remember him coming up the stairs, literally sitting on the edge of the bed. My sister was too young to know what was going on, and I think I understood. Telling me, he said, "Honey, Dad's going to have to move. I'm going to be away for maybe a year. I'll come home almost every weekend, just moving down to Wilmington, where Uncle Frank is. And when I get a job, and I'm going to get a job, honey, Uncle Frank's lined something up for me, and we get a place, I'll come back and get you and Mom and Valerie and Jimmy, and it's going to be okay." And he believed it was going to be okay. Therefore, I believed it was going to be okay. But what I didn't realize till I got a lot older, how difficult for a proud man it must have been to have stood in the kitchen before he walked up in my grandfather's kitchen and turned to his father-in-law and said, "Ambrose, can the family stay here? It may be up to a year." He used to say a job's about a lot more than a paycheck, Joe. It's about dignity. An awful lot of people have been stripped of their dignity. This recession has accelerated in a way that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. But the truth is, there's an awful lot of people out there who are just wondering, are they going to be able to say what my father said and believed? And our goal, this administration goal, is that every one of those parents who made that walk to be able to look in their kid's eye and say, "Honey, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." And mean it. Mean it. So for me, what this is about beyond the economic issues is about whether or not all those people out there who are struggling, who are working, making what appeared to be a good salary and still barely hanging on, are we going to give them an even shot to just be able to settle down a little bit, know they're going to be able to stay there, and know they're going to be able to get there if they work hard, and they're working hard. So that's what this is about. It's a slightly different perspective and focus than we've had on the road, and I'm anxious to get started. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to sit down and call on board. Now, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to invite each of you to make an opening comment for about 5 minutes or so, or whatever you decide. And then I've asked the panel, and before we came in, I really want them actually, engaging one another, and I'm going to raise some questions if it's appropriate, because I really like to have a discussion about many of the issues we've raised and some that haven't been raised. So let's, I guess we'll start just around the table. Or do we have an order? Maybe we'll start with my friend from Massachusetts, who, when Boston lost, he stopped everything. He didn't start to, anyway.
Well, I think you just said it all. Could I move to adjourn? Yeah. Just a little bit of history. During the several decades before the 1980s, the American middle class, as us old people remember, became a wonder of the world because it included such a large percentage of the country. Some people called it a universal middle class, as in universal health care, universal public education. That was an overstatement, but it wasn't a wild overstatement. That large middle class was a result of widespread economic mobility. It wasn't big because it had always been big. In the 1920s, the middle class included, according to Fortune magazine, just 15% of the country. It was big because it got big, because people made it get big, and because a lot of households who'd once been way down the income ladder got the chance to move up. With such a large middle class, there was a lot of economic equality. There were poor people, but their numbers were falling by the 70s. There were rich people too, but as Paul Krugman puts it, there weren't that many and they weren't that rich. But by the 1980s, all that was giving way to something much different. In 1984, in the wake of a severe recession, the Reagan recession, Walter Mondale said, "The middle class is standing on a trap door." Millions of households by then had already fallen through it. Other households would too in the future unless something was done, but little was. In 1988, Michael Dukakis said the middle class is getting squeezed. The trapdoor was still there, and now the prices of college and housing and energy and health insurance were going up faster than the paychecks of most workers. But then, too, little was done. In 1992, in wake of the Bush 41 recession, Bill Clinton spoke of the middle class as the forgotten middle class. The trapdoor was still there, the squeeze was still there, and now the middle class was neglected by its national government, even as it had to work longer hours at shorter pay and have less time left for the kids. In the Clinton economy of the late 1990s, the middle class did get relief. The labor market tightened up, rank and file workers got some bargaining power, and many of them could get a raise. But this relief proved to be only a respite. For then came the years 2001 through 2008. At the beginning, a recession. At the end, a prolonged recession and a financial crisis. In the years in between, what most Americans got was no growth or a lot worse. The trapdoor still there, the squeeze still there, the neglect still there, and other pressures besides, some long-standing, some more recent. But now we have an administration that has driven a stake in the ground and said, no more neglect, we're going to deal with this. I don't think that success can come quickly or easily. A decline that has been unfolding for decades obviously can't be offset overnight. And the roots of this decline are many and varied, social as well as economic. They involve living arrangements as well as paychecks, sweatshops in Thailand as well as the price of corn in Mexico, inner-city teachers as well as union-busting lawyers. It's a big subject. If there were a PBS documentary on it, Ken Burns could easily fill 2 hours a night for 5 straight nights, maybe 10 straight nights. Also, the roots of the decline are intricate. Not only do they include things to be confronted, they include things to be protected as well. And how do you deal with this decline while you dig out of the rubble that is still being created by the policies of the last administration? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Larry?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'll forego the discussion of my needing to be consulted about the Phillies' loss as well as a native Philadelphian. The middle class has been struggling for decades, just as you said, and the Great Recession is, in fact, only making it worse. And it's important that we think about how to make sure, as we emerge from the Great Recession and do everything we can to make that happen, that we actually make it easy for people to get into the middle class and secure their position. I imagine the situation of the middle class as people sitting in a rowboat in very choppy waters. No matter how well they row, no matter how good their boat is, they can't make progress because the waters are so choppy. And that's why the Middle Class Task Force has to focus both on calming the water as well as equipping people to do well in their rowboat. Today we're here to talk about why the waters are so choppy and perhaps what we can do to calm those waters. In my view, the reason the waters have been very choppy for decades is simple. It's the relentless erosion of good quality jobs and the wage stagnation that has affected all segments of the workforce. This has not been an accident. This is the result of conscious policies that focus on reducing business costs, lowering consumer prices so that we are all supposed to be better off in our role as consumers. But in fact, many of those policies have actually weakened our ability to earn a decent standard of living and fuel the consumption we need to grow the economy. We've introduced lots of competition from low-wage producers abroad. We've deregulated many industries. We've weakened our labor standards and made the minimum wage hardly effective at all. We've chopped huge holes in our safety net. We've allowed the situation to occur, as you said, Mr. Vice President, that people who want to seek collective bargaining, have a union, and negotiate for a fair share, it's not really that easy for them to do so anymore. And we've also tolerated very high periods of unemployment over the last 30 years at times that made life difficult. All of this has eroded people's ability to earn a decent standard of living, and it has created that gap you've talked about between what workers produce and the wages that they are paid. The consequence is the economic growth based on debt and asset bubbles, and it laid the foundation for the great worldwide recession that we're now in. To achieve shared prosperity, which is what I think we all are seeking to do, we have to have an economy centered on good quality jobs and making sure that typical workers' pay rises in tandem with growing productivity. As you've noted, the State of Working America, which we have produced at the EPI for several decades, has documented these facts over and over and over again, that we've had this perverse real wage stagnation for most of the last 30 years, except for a short period in the late 1990s. Most recently, even in the expansion of the 2000s, we find that people with a college degree even had totally flat wages and compensation starting in 2002. And we all know about the erosion of access to health insurance and pensions. I think it's really poignant that a high school graduate today, when they get a job in their early 20s, have only a 1/3 chance of getting health insurance from an employer. It used to be around 2/3 30 years ago. Now, the next point is there's really no good excuse for this. The economy produced enough output that we could have had a growing middle class, and we could have had much higher growth in living standards. As I said at the outset, there's a notable gap between the wages that people have earned and the productivity, the basic goods and services per hour produced by the workforce. In fact, over the last period, the 1979 to 2007 period, before the Great Recession, productivity was actually up 71%. And as the Vice President pointed out, despite solid productivity in the last expansion, middle-income, working-age households actually lost ground. So clearly, the productivity has been generating benefits that have flowed mostly upscale. The upper 1% of earners have seen their annual salaries grow by about 158% from 1979 to 2007. And if you look at the upper part of that upper 1%, the upper tenth of that upper 1%, their salaries grew 361%. That's pretty remarkable. The bottom 90% saw the salaries in that same period grow by only 16%, and almost all of that was in the late 1990s. So we see that the benefits of the growth have been very unequally shared. We have to fix that. Now, the wage challenges of the broad middle class cannot be explained by their inadequate education or skills. 30 years ago, in 1979, we had a roughly equal share of people who had a college degree or were high school dropouts, around 20% each. Nowadays, 31% of the workforce has a college degree or more, and the people that are high school dropouts, less than 10%, only 6% of the native-born workforce. There's an additional third of the workforce that has some education beyond high school, and a lot of those have an actual associate college degree. And as I've mentioned, even those with a 4-year college degree have not fared well, the decade recently. And we also know that young people graduating from college and getting jobs, let's say in their mid-20s, earn less now than the person who was like that a year before, and that's been going on for 8 to 10 years. So this is not to say that education is important. It's absolutely essential that everybody can get the education that they want and every opportunity. But it is not a sufficient way to deal with this problem. We have to be able to produce good jobs for people at every level of education. So as the President has said, we need to develop a new foundation for growth. This means enhancing our productivity growth. This means transitioning to a low carbon economy, energy alternatives, building the green job economy. But it also means we need a relentless focus on generating good quality jobs and building an economy where all the workforce is going to benefit from rising productivity. Now, if I might, one of our colleagues that was going to be here today was Belle Sawhill from Brookings Institution, and she recently published a book with Ron Haskins called Creating an Opportunity Society. And I want to just bring in one of the important points that she was going to make, because they focus a lot on economic mobility, the ability of people to rise within their life from one income group, let's say, to another, or from one generation to another. And it's important to note that there is mobility in our society, and there has been. But there's a lot less mobility than people are aware. We have actually less mobility than in many other advanced countries. It's possible to climb the ladder, Bell points out. It requires education, it requires work, and it requires strong families. But climbing the ladder is hard, and it's actually getting harder. And the reason why it's getting harder is because the rungs on the ladder are getting further apart. That's the inequality that we face. All this was true before the Great Recession. It's even more true now, and that's an important part of what we have to address. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to hope we hear more in this discussion. Heather?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for inviting us all here today. I think this is going to be a really great conversation. I have one point that I want to leave you with today, and that is that the fact that most women are now either their family's breadwinner or co-breadwinner fundamentally alters the challenges facing middle-class families. The ripple effect from women moving out of the home and into paid employment affects nearly everything in daily life, especially since the institutions around us, schools, churches, employers, government, haven't really adjusted to the way we now work and live. Building a vibrant middle class requires understanding and addressing these day-to-day realities. Now, of course, just a few decades ago, the typical family with children was a married couple with a breadwinner dad and a stay-at-home mom. Today, only 1 in 5 families look like this. The other 4 out of 5 either have 2 breadwinners, a mom and a dad both working, or they're a single-parent family. That's a profound shift in how middle-class families live in over a relatively short time frame. Yet the world around us hasn't seemed to come to terms with this new reality. No longer do most families have someone at home full-time to pick up a sick child from school or to help out an ailing neighbor. Schools still let children out long before most parents' workday ends and shut down for months at a time. Affordable, quality childcare outside the hours of the traditional workday is nearly non-existent, even though we live in a 24/7 economy, and many parents are working these non-standard hours. And care for our aging and ailing relatives is difficult with a national family leave policy that only covers about half the labor force. Now, as an economist, like many of my colleagues on this panel today, I see the well-being of the middle class in terms of income. But as the old adage goes, time is money, and today's middle-class families have lost a great deal of time and with it flexibility. Compared to the late 1970s, today's typical middle-class family puts in 568 hours more hours of work more hours per year at work. That's over 14 weeks of full-time work that's been lost. That's less time for home-cooked meals, less time for picking up a child after school, less time for volunteer activities in churches and schools across America. Now, my colleagues are telling you about why middle-class families are putting in so many more hours of work. Quite simply, they need the money just to stay afloat. Married couple families with a stay-at-home wife have seen absolutely no increase in their standard of living in over 30 years. So women becoming workers is a key way that families have addressed the middle-class squeeze, even though it leads to a time squeeze at home. But of course, many women also want to work, even when they have young children at home. Our new report that we did here at the Center for American Progress with Maria Shriver found that overwhelmingly, men and women both agree that women working is good for society and it's good for the economy. Yet many say that they remained very concerned about what's happening to those who need care, since there's no longer someone at home full-time to do this. This is one of the most profoundly important challenges facing middle-class families. Now, as a nation, we need to recognize that we aren't going to go back to a time when most families have a full-time stay-at-home caregiver. That ship has sailed. Mothers are now the primary breadwinner or co-breadwinner in nearly 2/3 of families today. What we need to do is to begin addressing the very real challenges facing families that don't have a full-time stay-at-home caregiver. Most workers, including most middle-class workers, do not have the workplace flexibility or paid parental or family leave to make work for them. Recently, the administration recognized that H1N1 is a national emergency, yet 4 in 10 private sector workers must choose between taking care of a child with the flu or losing their pay, or quite possibly their job or being reprimanded. Now, a vibrant middle class is certainly not built by accident. And today, taking seriously the challenge of investing in a strong middle class means taking a long, hard look at the realities of families' day-to-day lives, the dual worker families, the single parent families, and yes, the 1 in 5 traditional families as well, and reworking our institutions to address these challenges.
Thanks, Heather. Jim?
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. This has been so far just an absolutely fascinating and informative discussion, and I hope it continues to be. It's such an important topic. As progressives, we are true experts on identifying and understanding and diagnosing people's economic security problems. But as progressives, we are less proficient at understanding and clearing the hurdles that the middle class has to achieve economic success. So what I'd like to talk about in my couple of minutes is the unique hurdles in the 21st century that Americans face in achieving economic success. So the first challenge is actually for us as progressives, that we need to have a better understanding of the economic circumstances of the middle class. So the median household income in this country is $49,000, but that includes households headed by 19-year-olds and households headed by 79-year-olds. We don't have a jobs policy for a 79-year-old. When you look at people who are working age, and if you look at really all we do in our economic policies of creating jobs and opportunity and affording college and balancing work and family, they're aimed at a particular segment of the population, and it's basically people between the ages of 25 and 62. And the median household income of those folks, it's about $60,000. If they're married, it's well north of $70,000. If both spouses had income at any time during the year, it's well north of $80,000. To be sure, that is not a Paris Hilton lifestyle, but it is the difference between the struggle to get by and the struggle to get ahead. Second, there is a vast donut hole, a chasm in government policy aimed at this heart of the middle class. And if you look at these working age folks, you know, what the Vice President called the 50 to 125,000 people, they're too wealthy for the signature progressive ideas that are generally considered middle class ideas, like SCHIP and EITC and Pell and those things. They're fantastic programs, but they're programs to help people get into the middle class. They are not wealthy enough for the conservative trickle-down theories, you know, of capital gains. So when you look at these folks and they look at government, they just don't see how government makes an appreciable positive difference in their lives. They don't really see how government is really relevant to them as they seek a path to success. Yes, if something bad happens, if they lose a job, they see where government comes in there, but not in their trajectory to success. So why is this critical, that there's this donut hole and that we need to close it? Because fundamentally, and this is number 3, the rules to attain economic success have really changed over the past few decades, and they continue to change. And let me just give you one example. In the past, your retirement was planned for you by your employer. Now, you plan your entire retirement by yourself. You're on your own. What does that mean? It means by the time you're 28 or 30 years old, the decisions you made about whether to invest in a 401k, how much to invest, and where to invest it will have a dramatic impact on the lifestyle you have when you're 78 years old. The middle class is a paradox. On the one hand, they are unfailingly optimistic. They believe that their success or failure is almost entirely due to measures within their control. It's one of the reasons why America is a great country. At the same time, they are very, very anxious, and they have been for some time. For some, their anxiety is rooted in the immediacy of this dreadful economy that we inherited. That's for sure. But for most, that anxiety is rooted in the fear that they will not achieve the aspirations and goals that they envision for themselves, that they imagine for themselves. So, as progressives, we will always be on the side of folks who struggle to get by. But as this economy returns to normalcy, in large part because of what this administration is doing, and we set up an economic agenda for the middle class, let's meet the middle class where they are and help them achieve their aspirations, which is success. And let's make sure that as we do an economic agenda for the middle class, that it's equal parts, 50-50, economic security and economic success, because those are the two pillars of the American dream. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Melody?
Great. Well, first of all, Mr. Vice President, I want to thank you for inviting us to be here today, and also thank you for your leadership on this issue. It is really unparalleled, so thank you for that. And also, it's a pleasure to be back at home at CAP. I'll be going back with the Vice President, but you can return home. So thank you, for that. You know, Jim was talking about the optimism and the aspirations of the American people. And I remember when I had the privilege of working on the Obama-Biden campaign, traveling all over the country. I was in Missouri and big cities. I was in St. Louis, but also lots of little towns in Michigan. I was in Montana and Pennsylvania and all over Virginia. And every time I spoke to a group, the first question I would ask them is, do you believe in the American dream? Who believes in the American dream? And without exception, every hand in the room went up. I mean, there was that optimism that Jim and others have been talking about. But I think also, as the members of the panel were discussing, and my job here is just to do a little wrap up before we engage in a conversation, there is this sticky floor, glass ceiling, locked door phenomenon that people are facing right now. And, I think Ralph was talking about it along with Heather, and the factors that precipitated and have fostered the challenges that are facing the middle class right now, and the policies that don't make sense for the middle class right now. Certainly, as Heather was talking about, in terms of all those increased days, weeks of work, Jim and I were kind of chuckling ruefully over here that, we certainly feel like we're working all of those extra days and weeks right now. And Larry was talking about the wage stagnation that people are feeling, and how moving up and into the middle class and feeling comfortable in the middle class is really, really elusive right now. And I think Jim also certainly made the point that as we think about our policies going forward, and not only making sure that the security is there, but we have to be very forward-leaning, and we have to think about how we're going to fulfill those hopes and those dreams and those aspirations, and give people the tools they need so they can not only stay in the middle class, but so they can rise higher and make sure that their children have the same thing. Certainly the President and the Vice President have been working very, very hard to create the foundation for the security we need, and so that we can build and create the kind of future that we've been talking about for people. Healthcare, and I look in the audience and see people who have been champions of this issue for a very long time, is certainly one of those most fundamental pillars. For years and years and years, and I remember working in the Senate and with the Vice President and others on this issue, and talking about how people are stretching harder and harder. We're talking about those rungs that are further and further apart, to get that house in the good school district. So you stretch a little harder so that you can get there. Or the two wage income earners who are in the workforce, not so that you can have, the fancy TV and the fancy car, but so that you can just keep your heads above water and do the best that you can for your families. All people are stretching harder and harder, but at the same time, they're watching those healthcare costs increase and eat away at their family income, and recognizing just how close they are to falling off the ledge. One job loss, one illness, And there you are, you've fallen over the cliff and out of the middle class and into the abyss. I remember a couple of years ago, my dad was in and out of the hospital for about 6 weeks straight until we could figure out what was going on. You know, major surgery, intensive care, the whole 9 yards. And I remember when he got his health care bill later, and he looked at me, and, you know, he's got insurance. And he looked at me, he's like, Mel, if I hadn't had insurance, $80,000? What was I going to do with an $80,000 health care bill? I mean, that's the kind of insecurity that exists for people around healthcare that we recognize that we have to fix. We were talking about in education, and that's such an important and rich conversation. One of the things the president and the vice president have talked about is a cradle to career education, set of education policies. Thinking about not just kindergarten, but, you know, day one for children, the right kind of quality pre-K, leading into the right kind of K through 12 education, and the importance of community colleges for the middle class, a great underserved, under-resourced tool for the middle class, something that the federal government over the years hasn't recognized can be a tool for the middle class, in addition to four-year institutions and the policies that we're working on right now to try and strengthen that. We have a bill that we've just gotten through the House of Representatives, working on in the Senate, that looks at those those bookends, early education and community colleges and higher education, and then the work that we've done through the Recovery Act to try and spur the reform and accountability necessary in K through 12. And also, I think, going to Heather's point, you know, the work-family issues, you know, again, some of them you can't quantify or put a price tag on, but they definitely go to people's, their peace of mind, their ability to care for their families in the way that they need to, whether it's their children or their parents or both. To be able to, you know, in the middle of H1N1, when the government is saying you need to stay home until you finish your Tamiflu, and you're thinking, if I stay home till I finish my Tamiflu, I'm not going to have a job to go back to. So we have to think through those policies. We're certainly talking about the employers who are doing the right thing out there, but what's going to be our national policy in this area? But at the same time as we're talking about this set of issues, there are also those people who aspire to be in the middle class. And when I remember the day that the president signed or announced the Middle Class Task Force and asked the vice president to go around the country and to work on these issues because they were so important, this is what he said. When I talk about the middle class, I'm talking about folks who are currently in the middle class, but also people who aspire to be in the middle class. We're not forgetting the poor. They are going to be front and center because they too share the American dream. And just take one more minute in my time to mention two groups that I think fall in that category. First of all, immigrants and new immigrants to our country, often working, but certainly working in low-income jobs. And their children are often able to benefit from the immigration to the United States and for new citizenship here. But the complexity around their health care and education issues also tends to minimize their success. So we have to think about how we're going to make sure that our newest citizens are fully integrated into this country and aspiring for and able to attain the American dream. We're really proud of the fact in our Homeland Security Appropriations Bill that it included an immigrant integration program to try and address some of those issues. And then I also want to just mention, you know, people of color and particularly African Americans. Great strides that have been taken and made over the last many decades, but still really struggling, more likely to be in poverty, finding it more difficult to get out of poverty, and certainly more easily knocked out of the middle class. And what we have to do to make sure that that group and certainly all people of color are also able to stay in in the middle class and aspire further ahead. So I really appreciate this panel, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have, because as the Vice President has said, you know, going around the country, talking about focusing on these issues, getting the best ideas, and then being able to go back and think through our policies and our budget very carefully so that we can make sure that the American dream isn't just a dream, but it's a reality for more of our people.
Thank you, Melody. Let me, I hope the press, I hope I express this clearly enough so the press doesn't misunderstand what I'm going to say. I'm going to be the devil's advocate for a moment and ask you all questions that get posed to me or assertions made to me by people who don't share, to use your phrase, Jim, this progressive notion of how we proceed. And they're not bad people. I mean, it's not like these are evil people who don't care about, the middle class. But you talked about the aspirations of the middle class. I was with an acquaintance at home in Delaware. I get home fairly frequently, and he had read something where I had talked about aspirations. And he said, the problem with you guys is you keep encouraging aspirations, speaking to aspirations, so they're just not realistic. It's not realistic in today's world for everyone to be able to achieve what their aspirations are. Their aspirations have exceeded what the aspirations, and he went on to say, my parents' aspirations were to do boom boom, and they met those. But now their children's aspiration is not to live in Mayfield, my neighborhood, but to live in Westover Hills, which is a neighborhood we used to call Leftover Bills when we were kids. And their aspirations, so the aspirations are sort of getting out of whack, was his point. Talk to me about what you think, though, when you talk about this paradox. Talk about, are the aspirations reasonable, or is it just in the world we're in now, it's just not reasonable to have the aspirations that I assume you're referring to, and I don't know exactly what they are, but I think I know what you mean.
That's a great question. So I've talked about this, on the Hill and other places for a while, and one of the comments that I've often got is there'll be people talking about the estate tax, and they'll say, yeah, there's polling on the estate tax, and that there are people who say they're against the estate tax even though they make $50,000 a year because they think someday they're going to make $5 million. And I haven't seen a poll that says that. There might be a poll that actually says it, but I think it might show the limitations of polling. Because I don't think that people who are earning $50,000 or $80,000 or their family income, I don't think they're delusional. I don't think they feel they're going to become multimillionaires. Maybe that's a dream that they have, but I don't think they see that it's their realistic dream. Their aspirations, I believe, are the aspirations that are common pretty much to all of us. Owning a home, generally getting ahead, being able to send your kids to college, taking care of elderly parents the way you talked about. And, I grew up, and I think it's hard. I think these rules have changed, and I'll give you one example. I grew up in a very middle-class family. I graduated from college in 1982. My brother graduated in 1979. We both went to, I went to BU, he went to Penn. My very middle-class family could afford to send my brother and I to college without incurring debt. That would be absolutely impossible today. Absolutely impossible. And the premium for earning a college degree today is greater than it was even back then, and it's going to continue to be greater. So there are, so in a way, yes, it's harder to reach these aspirations, but they still are very realistic aspirations.
Well, Ralph, you and I have been hanging out, as I said, for a while. We come from similar backgrounds, and we've often talked to each other about, both our dads back when we graduated the same year, 1728, no, 1961 right. From high school. My dad was making about, what we thought was a good salary. He thought it was a good salary, $1,000 a month, a little over $1,000 a month. He made, my recollection is $12,600. I have a reason for remember that I won't bore you with. But, and you were telling me your dad was making about, he was a manager as well, but without a college education, making about the same. And you gave me a little note, and you said to me that if at that time, in 1961, making that income, extrapolating that to today's income would be $86,190.
If I've converted that properly. We have two economists here.
But talk to me about whether or not the aspiration is still, reasonable to be able to live in my 3-bedroom split-level home, which is still a nice neighborhood, the home you were raised in. I mean, are these realistic assumptions or aspirations people have?
Yeah, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the same neighborhood that Michelle Obama did years later, about 4 blocks from where she lived. And so I paid a lot of attention to what she was saying during the campaign when she said, you know, Americans don't really want that much. And I think that to aspire to a steady job, home ownership, a car to get around, I don't think that those are extravagant aspirations. And I think that many, many people in the middle class or aspiring to middle class want only that. And if they have children, opportunities for their children. There's no question that one of the things that's happened, and this city is a capital of this part of the country, there is now a large share of the country that is a well-educated meritocracy that has extremely strong aspirations for itself and for its children. And I respect that. I live down the road from Amherst College. The high investment kids from all over the country come to Amherst College. They've been carefully, nurtured, and they've had this internship and that internship and this bit of adventure travel. I think that the desire that people like that have to invest in their children is wonderful. But I think that in some of the D.C. suburbs in Virginia and Montgomery County and elsewhere, we do see those extremely, some of the best, most dedicated parents in history are living today, and they have children who are benefiting by that. But there's still much of the country that would be very happy to settle for a lot less. Yet, even as they're happy to settle for less, it's harder for them to get even the less, I think.
Yeah, jump in.
I
Anybody
want to jump in on this a little bit because I think it's a really damaging idea that somehow people should lower their aspirations. I don't think they aspire to all that much. But let me just go over some facts. That is the way I see it. Since the mid-1990s, we've had actually what economists refer to as an acceleration of productivity growth. That is, we are actually able to produce more income over the last 10, 15 years at a faster rate than we were in the 15, 20 years prior to that. Moreover, we know that people are actually working more hours, right, per year. There's more family members working. 3, we also know that people have far more education now than they did 30 years ago. So what is the explanation for why people can't have what they used to have a generation ago? What can possibly explain why a couple can't be, as you said earlier in your introduction, Mr. Vice President, the kind of house in a particular type of suburb, it could be supported by one paycheck. Now people feel they need 2. It's not an economic certainty that is this. It is how we have arranged the economy. And the economy is not God-given. This is something we create. We create the rules. We can shape it so that we actually have very different outcomes. So I think it's, I find it annoying if people were to say somehow people are expecting too much, living beyond their means. I think we need to raise our expectations about what kind of economy we can actually have.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree with Larry. And in addition to the fact that we shouldn't ask people to lower reasonable expectations and aspirations, quite frankly, I think it's built into who we are as a country, to hope for more, to want for more. And I think particularly that it's often driven by what people want for their families and for their children. And I think also, as you said, Mr. Vice President, a certain level of dignity. I think also what sometimes people perceive as wanting, a bling bling lifestyle is really, I want that better house because that better house is in a better school district, and houses in better school districts tend to cost more. I have so many friends with children. I'm sure there are probably a lot of people out there sitting in the audience who have been through that experience of weighing, do I move to this house that costs a little bit more in the better school district, or do I pay the private school tuition, and making those set of choices. That also means it's incumbent upon us to continue to work through the issues around education. But I think some of that is reflected in what people are trying to do for their families and certainly do for their children.
How do you answer, Larry, the thing I get thrown back at me is that This split between income and productivity growth in the middle class, that productivity growth is due to technology, and that lower wages are a consequence of that skill bias technology change. That means that if you go to college, you're more likely to have a skill compatible with these technological changes, like you can program software, you can do, but if you're not, your skills are not compatible with this technology, and therefore, and you go to low wage countries that can produce this. I mean, how, like you said, we control. I mean, we control. We set up this economy, but is it true we set it up? We're now in this flat world. I mean, it's, some would argue it's beyond our control to deal with some of this. So how do you respond to, and by the way, I don't agree with anything I'm asking here. Let's make that clear. But I do think it's important we raise, sort of the counter arguments, at least the ones I get.
Sure.
That I get all the time. So what is the answer, in your view, that this is a consequence of technology, and those who are not just gone to college but have gone to the best colleges, have the highest skills, they are going to benefit because they can design software. They know how to do that. But that's not the case for the rest of the and that's where the productivity is.
Yeah, that's a good question. 15 years ago, it would have been argued that there's a skills mismatch. People don't have the skills necessary to have good jobs, and that everyone had to have a college education. Then we actually noted in the 1990s, and especially in the last decade, people with a 4-year college degree haven't been actually doing so well. And in fact, the wages of college graduates are moving pretty much the same as those with just a high school degree. Then comes along a new argument. Well, it's not just you need a college degree. You have to have a certain kind of skill with a college degree. So let's just go over some of the facts. 10% of the workforce has more than a college degree, some kind of advanced degree. Let's just assume they're okay. I'm not sure that's true. Then another 20% have a college degree. So now we're going to say only half of those have the correct skills to have a good middle-class life. Do we actually believe that we have an economy that only can support 20% of the people with a good middle-class life? Is that possibly true? And if that's true, is that should we accept those rules? That can't possibly be the case, in my view, and it's not the case. So I think they need to be called out on this. People are saying that you have to have this particular package of cognitive skills, or else you can't succeed. We have 2/3, to 70% of the workforce that don't even have a 4-year college degree. Are we going to abandon them and not make sure that they have good jobs? We can actually do that. It's very much within our power to make sure that, in fact, everybody has a decent chance at the middle-class life and an access to a decent quality job.
Can I jump in on this?
Oh,
one?
yeah, no, everybody.
Yeah. I would add to that. Larry, I think your point that the middle class is built, and it's about these institutions that we create to support it, are super important in that, and that productivity's increased. We're richer today than we were a decade ago or 2 decades ago, but that wealth hasn't been shared. And as I look out at the audience, I know that I hope many people will appreciate that a big piece of this is also about the decline in unions in this country. That's been an important way of building up the middle class throughout this century. And we've lost a piece of that in recent decades. And just one thing, Melody, about your comment about the schools. It's so amazing that we have to choose our homes based on schools, that we're not making that broad-based investment to make sure every child gets the kind of education, so you don't have to make that choice. So again, it's about the investments that we're making to support and to build a vibrant middle class for everybody. So both in the private sector and how we think about workers, but also with our public sector investments.
Mm-hmm. Larry, I don't think anybody is saying there's 2/3 of the population that has less than a college education, and they're just going to be left. We have to realize they're going to be left behind, and that's the way it's going to be. That is not acceptable. But I think that we're somewhere in between the stage where, as a country, where in the past, let's say 1945 to 1970, America was a rule maker. We ran the world economically. We were just far superior. We are now we've started to move, and maybe more accelerating, to the point where how much are we rule makers and how much are we rule takers? And how much can we really make these rules, and how much do we have to say, like, well, these are the rules, we better figure out something here. And we're somewhere along that spectrum. And both for our macro economy, how we grow this economy in the future and make sure that in the year 2050, America is #1 and leading the world, because the alternative could be a nightmare. If it's not America, who else is it going to be? And how do you bring the middle class along with it? It means that realizing the places where we can still set the rules, and realizing the places where we can't set them, but we can win playing by these rules. And I think that whether you're an individual trying to think about how I'm going to succeed, or a country, how we're going to succeed, I think you have to realize, like, where are we rule makers and where are we rule takers?
Just a quick, we're debating the answer to a really important question, which is who owns the gains in productivity? And nobody ever, that question is never put to the American people. We don't hold a referendum on that question. It's being decided day by day by day in many different parts of the society and the economy. Very quickly, I did not follow your good example yesterday when I came into the Baltimore airport. I did not get on the train, as I almost always do. I took another conveyance, and a ticket on that conveyance, I discovered, is $37. I will not identify this mode of transit, because I may say things about the company that aren't true. The last time, as I recall, I took that mode of conveyance was 4 years ago this month, and it was $22 for a one-way ticket. So that means that a one-way ticket on that from that vendor of transportation costs $15 more today than it did 4 years ago. The economists will correct me, but I think that's a 68% increase in the ticket price. Let's be kind to the company and say that half of that 68%, 34 points, have gone to cover higher fuel costs. Something tells me that the other 34% of the increase in that fare probably did not go to raises for the people who sell the tickets. Why is that? What if you and I were working behind the counter and we showed up every day and we were courteous and did our job, and you said to me, gee, we just bumped the ticket price up to $26, Ralph. And a few months later, hey, it's up to 28 now. They're going to 30 in 3 months. Eventually we might say, gee, maybe we could get a raise. How would we start that conversation? You know, you might go to the boss and say, because you're bolder, and I'm going to hang back.
I'd be the one fired.
I've got mouths to feed. And say, hey, you know, how about I'm making $9 an hour, how about 10 or 11? So you come back to, you say, well, I just got fired. I'm a troublemaker. What do I do? Do I back down? Do I pretend I don't? You have to have some mechanism to begin to take those increased gains. I think that those are productivity gains. I'm not an economist, but just how do you make sure that the people who are, you know, running the vans and selling the tickets get a share of that? And one thing that unions have traditionally done was to start that conversation and give the people behind the ticket counter and the people behind the wheel of the van the collective leverage to start those conversations, and in a deliberate, formal way, try to bring them to an acceptable compromise to both sides that captures some of those productivity gains for the people who sell the tickets and load the bags.
Yeah.
Well, that's why this administration feels so strongly about, look, the premise the President and I have, and the administration, is that it's awful hard to figure out how to grow the middle class without growing the union movement, without those who want to join a union be able to join a union, because a lot of things have changed. In my view, I was a senator for a long time. There is sort of beginning, I would argue, in my career at least, around the late 70s, there was an all-out assault, an all-out war declared on labor. And for the longest time, labor was incredibly defensive because it was blamed for every problem. It was blamed for inflation. It was blamed for it was a blame, and for a while, you know, the American public seemed to be buying it. But how important is it to turn this around? How important is it to, again, to use a trite phrase, level the playing field for those who want to organize, to be able to organize without having to go through the torturous process that exists now? I mean, how much I mean, not just not a political side, from the standpoint of economists, how important is that to being able to give those aspiring to and those in the middle class more leverage and power to maintain their position in what we call the middle class?
Well, I'll give you my view on that, and maybe Heather wants to weigh in as well. You know, I think one of the things we've actually lost is not just about those who are in unions and might benefit them, but it's about setting standards in the workplace, in industries and occupations, so that we have decent standards and that employers are not competing about who can make the jobs worse, but they're competing with how to make this products and services better. And we've kind of lost that. We now have the standards being set by employers that I think are not so interested in good quality jobs. And I think that you can't do that, have that process setting. Some of it is government policy, labor standards, the minimum wage, Fair Labor Standards Act, all those sorts of things. Some of it is strong unions. And I think that we've lost that, and we're going to have to get that back. And just bringing it back to the earlier conversation about rule takers, rule makers, we live in a global economy. There's everything right about that. I don't think there's any way to go back. There's no way we should. That doesn't mean that the rules of the global economy as presented to us are the right ones to make sure that workers here are moving ahead as well as workers abroad. No one, when they sold globalization in this country, said, oh, let's do this, but by the way, you all can't have middle-class jobs anymore. I think if that is underlying what people are saying, if people want to say that, if company leaders want to say that, or if economists want to say that, then they ought to really come out and tell the American people that, because I think American people don't believe that, and I think they shouldn't believe that.
Well, and I mean, I want to address both questions, but on this question of unions, I mean, they're important to also help us start the conversation. I mean, I think what you said, Ralph, is really important. A worker that sees the gains in productivity not going to them has no recourse if they don't have some way to start that conversation with their employer where it's not just about them. And then many of the other issues facing middle-class families around the workplace flexibility, around the benefits they need, around the ways to make it work for themselves and their families, that also needs to have a conversation. And it can't just be about one worker, because these aren't challenges just for one worker. These are challenges for everyone. So building a middle class that allows everyone to be both workers and caretakers will require a broader conversation, and unions have a critical, and have been playing a very critical role in that in the places that are unionized. But I would also, I don't think we can underestimate in some ways the importance that unions, the important role that unions play in both historically building our middle class and what they could do if we could help them to grow again. But also on the issue of rulemaker, you know, many of our economic competitors have the kinds of economic policies and labor market policies that I think we would like to see here. And again, on many of these work-life benefit policies, every other industrialized country has paid family and medical leave, but we don't. I mean, so we're not the rule. You're right, we're not the rule maker. We're sort of very much lagging behind. But if they can do it, and if they can have, you know, health care for everyone, why can't we? We're all competing in the same global economy. So it really does beg the question why our economic competitors can do many of the kinds of policies that we haven't been able to do here at home to create a vibrant middle class here.
Right, and I think that's been exactly a part of the conversation that we've all tried to have that conversation during the debate around healthcare reform. You know, why it's important, certainly why, you know, more and more business leaders have come to the table, along with union leaders and others, to say, this is important, you know, for our bottom line. We find it impossible to compete unless this country does something about it. It's a kitchen table question, but it's also, you know, a boardroom conversation and question as well.
Elaborate a little bit, Heather, on the point you made in your opening statement that that as women become the breadwinner or the co-breadwinner, the circumstances change, not just related to the paycheck, but what that does to quality of life issues for families. And talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, you know, it's sort of what I think of as it's the day to day. It's the stuff that everybody talks about, the water cooler, the stuff that you hear people, you know, talk about with their friends and family. That if women are breadwinners in most families, that, and again, we're talking about married couple families. We're not talking
Right,
about these
yeah,
dual
right,
earners. So, you know, setting aside the huge increase in single parenthood. What you have is families where they're struggling to figure out, well, who's going to pick up the kids after school, or, you know, who's going to make sure that the kids are ready, you know, to school or to, you know, to go to work. How are we going to create that balance both inside the home, but also make sure that we're able to focus at our jobs and be good workers? You know, so folks are dealing with, you know, if somebody gets sick, who's going to be the person to take time off work to either go pick somebody up or even to take the phone call? So it's leading to this constant negotiation both at work, or I'm sorry, at home, but it also needs to lead to a new renegotiation at the workplace. And right now it's the case that many workers don't feel that they have the right to ask their employer for a little flexibility. Maybe they don't have the right to a paid sick day, or maybe they're just a little bit afraid, especially given the recession, of losing their job if they're the one that stands out and says, well, actually, I've got this childcare conflict. But because we've moved beyond the point where this is just a few families, this is the modal family now. This is every family. So it's not the atypical case, it's the normal case. And so that one worker who's feeling it, actually everybody in their workplace is probably feeling it on some level. And even the single folks, we know that from the research that often it's the worker who's not married, who doesn't have kids, is the one who's responsible for taking care of grandma, or is the person who's taking care of the elderly parent, because they don't have those kid responsibilities. So it's not just, again, families with children, it's every family dealing with both the elder care and the kid issues. And since it is, we should be, you know, we need to do more to sort of make sure that
What are some of the things we should be doing?
Well,
From the standpoint of, at a government level, when people raise these issues, and I agree with you completely. By the way, it used to be, when that issue was raised 25 years ago, the answer you'd get was, well, they got to make a choice. Today, am I correct, in those dual wage earning families, you really both have to be working just to stay even. I mean, it's not like there's a choice. This is not, well, you know, my husband or wife is going to go to work and hadn't been working so that we can get a summer place at the beach, or so that we can have, you know, a Ferrari, or so we can do whatever. I mean, most of it today, am I correct from an economic standpoint that you know, to use the example, I kid, my staff is tired of hearing about Mayfield, the place I grew up in, but it's sort of a code word. I mean, you know, in my staff, but you know, to live in Mayfield now, or the comparable neighborhoods, you know, it seems as though, as I understand it, and for just observation and people I know, both have to work to be able to continue to live there. So it's not like, arguably it was, and it wasn't even then, but you know, 25, 30 years ago, well, you're going to go to work, okay, you've made a choice. You've made a choice that you want to go to a bigger home, or a better place, or have a different car, or have a vacation you didn't have before. So you got to make a choice. Take care of mom, take care of the kids, or you know, or don't, and have the better car, the home, etc. But am I correct, first of all, that by and large, that's not the choice? The choice is you got to have both those jobs just to sort of stay even. Is that accurate?
You have great wisdom, Mr. Vice President.
Well, no, by the way, I'm not being facetious.
No, I'm serious. It's actually absolutely true.
You still get from our, quote, free enterprise, right? And it's like, these are choices. You got to make tough choices. And so, you know.
But I think what Heather said was something that was very interesting when she said, in some families this is an economic necessity, and in some families this is economic aspiration. That the aspirations that women have for their career is just very, very different than it was 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. And, you know, looking at it as, you know, I'm a founder of an organization that employs people, and the way we look at this is, well, you know, not that if you have a family-friendly policy like this is something that hurts our business, but how do we attract, and this is maybe the way government should think and the way business should think, is there is a tremendous asset out there, which is there are women and men in married households, dual earner households, that have family pressures but are tremendously gifted workers. How do we make sure they work for us? Because they will help our company. and I want this person or that person or this person on my team. So I want to have a more family-friendly policy because I want to make sure I have them. And I think that we need to make an attitude flip here. If you look at the educational attainment, for example, of women compared to men, you know, it's over for us.
They're smarter.
You know, it's just that, you know, just the numbers. It's different. And like, so it's, yeah.
Obvious. It's obvious. It's always been obvious.
That's not
You
new
know,
to me.
it's
my house.
You know, but this is an asset. You know, and I think that in a way, it's like, stop looking at this as a, you know, for business, and business always a lot of times looks at these things as problems, but no, this is an opportunity for us to have some very, very talented, productive people working for us. Let's just make sure it works for them.
Well, what do Melanie and I do to, is there any role that we have as, you know, an administration, as government, to encourage or to legislate or to promote? I mean, you know, this is, you know, a number of things you've all mentioned are things that minimum wage you can deal with, unionization you can deal with by FCA. I mean, we should deal with them, I mean, but you know, there are things we can do. Other things we're saying is that, you know, is to encourage a changed attitude. You can't legislate a changed attitude. At least that's not my observation. Not been able to do that. So, what are the kinds of things we should be doing when Melanie and I walk away from here? What should we have in our toolkit that we go back and say, okay, these are some of the things that we should do, other than now leave to have lunch with the president?
That helps.
Okay, but seriously, what are some of the things we should be doing?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we can do. I mean, I think, you know, a couple of ways are to start the conversation in terms of thinking about the government as a model employer, thinking about federal contractors as making sure that they're model employers as well, and doing what we can on that level. Around the issues of workplace flexibility, we could build off the model that's been presented in the United Kingdom, where they've enacted a law that says everybody has the right to work, everybody who has small children can request a flexible schedule. Now, that in and of itself, it's not a mandate, doesn't cost a lot of money, but what the UK government did that was so unique is they did a mass education campaign around it. Really helped employers understand how this is good for business, it's good for the bottom line, and it's good for workers, and it helps change attitudes if people feel that they have the right to ask. But then a couple of things that do cost money that we should do is we should make sure that every family in America, if most parents are breadwinners, then they need time off when they have a new child or a family member is sick. And we need to make sure that they have the right to that paid time off, and that it is paid, because we know that middle-class families struggle to make ends meet. And quite frankly, when somebody's sick or you have a new kid, that's exactly when you can't afford to go without a paycheck. So those, I think, would be my, you know, on those issues, the top ones.
Anybody else?
I don't have any policy prescriptions, but I think what you said at the beginning is very important. That the objective here is to give people some free time for themselves, for each other, for their kids. Remember, one of the you mentioned that we come from very similar backgrounds, which is very, very true. But one difference I remember is that on Sunday night, we used to sit down and watch Maverick, and you watched The Wonderful World of Disney.
True.
And I remember that.
And we got ice cream too.
Right, which we didn't have. And you know, there has to be time on Sunday to sit down with ice cream and watch Maverick or Disney. Hey, we believe in choice.
Well,
But, I just this is just to finish up, but you've got something more important to do.
no,
In the Clinton administration, there was this kind of shadow debate over how a single mother ought to spend Monday through Thursday night. And Bob Reich wanted her at a community college taking a night course, and Donna Shalala wanted her walking and exercising to keep her weight down, avoid diabetes. And Richard Riley wanted her at the kitchen table helping her kids with their homework. You can't be all of those places at the same time. And these were people who wanted to help, by the way. These were the friends. These were their friends.
That's a great.
well, it is a great anecdote. Look, I can remember a poll done, I don't know how many years ago, not that long ago, when you can correct me on this, Heather, but my recollection is women were asked, what is the thing they want or need the most? And the answer was time. And this goes, maybe this is a place to end, not just about women, but is that this is about more than the paycheck. This is about the quality of life issues that allow you to be able to, but it can't happen unless you have a decent job. One of the things we're trying to do, and I think we're on the right track, is that we're trying to sort of lay a new foundation for a growth spurt in this country that is not based on a bubble. It's not based upon a dot-com bubble or a speculative real estate bubble, but it's based upon the kind of foundation that produces or lays, at least incentivizes the country to invest in things that you can really build good jobs of, build off of very good jobs. And we've assumed that means things like investing in and giving seed money for new technologies, for alternative energy sources, things that are the things that are going to produce the jobs, that are going to provide the jobs for the next 10, 20, 30 years, that allow us to get back in a position where someone could theoretically, on a single salary, live in a decent environment with a roof over their head in a safe neighborhood, with the ability to send their kid to a good school, and but so many other pieces. That's why we invested so much money in the Recovery Act and education, over $105 billion. I think is the single biggest infusion, correct me if I'm wrong, Melody, that's ever occurred. There's a lot of things we've known for a long, long time, and that is, you send that child to a quality preschool at age 4 or 5, they have a exponentially better chance of graduating from high school and staying out of the crime and drug stream. If you send the same kid, the same quality school, and wait till they're 6 or 7 years old. We've known that for 35 years, and we've never done it before. We've known a lot of things that we're only now beginning to try to implement. But one of the fascinating debates that continues, I think, still within among those of us who share the same value set and view the government as having some positive role to play here, is this distinction between what we list as a median income family, essentially below $50,000, and what you're talking about. If you look at those people between ages, I think you said 25 and 62 or 24 and 62, that you're talking about incomes that are $60,000, $70,000 to $80,000. And there's not many policies that are out there, other than the ones that you seem to be talking about, that alter the ability of those families to have flexibility to deal with their circumstances, that we've paid much attention to. At least we, my team. This president we're trying to, but it's that's why the one question I was going to ask and refrain from asking is, how do we define middle class? It's kind of in the eye of the beholder, but I do think there is some empirical data to suggest that it is what you're talking about, Jim. I mean, it also includes those folks who we traditionally don't think about. I remember, Melda, we used to have those debates in the Democratic caucus over the past years, and some was saying, wait a minute, people making with a couple kids, married couple, both working, making $85,000 a year. That's middle class. I mean, these folks are struggling, but it usually isn't the way that we talk about. I guess that's what you mean by the donut hole. Is that right? I mean, explain what you mean by the donut hole.
Well, I mean, I just think if you just look at policies where, people are priced out, government policies, earned income tax credit, it's somewhere around 33 or 35, Pell Grants around the same thing, Head Start a little bit lower, S-CHIP maybe a tiny bit higher. They're really aimed at folks that are in a much more precarious economic situation. They're in a much more, I would say, desperate economic situation. Once you get over that, there just really isn't that much for you. I mean, of course, you can get student loans and there's things like that, but it would be hard if you were earning 70 or 80,000 to say, what is it that the federal government gives directly to me? I think you would have people give you blank stares. Now, one of the reasons why we're going to pass health care for the first time, you know, after 35 years of trying,
Your mouth to God's ears.
knock on wood, is because for 35 years, look, 6 out of 7 people at a given moment have insurance. For the last 35 years, we focused on the one, and we're still taking care of the one in this bill, but we are much more focused on the 6 that have it. And that is entirely different. That's, you know, people couldn't mention pre-existing conditions and benefit caps and things like that in the past. We never talked about those things in the past. That is addressing the concerns of people $60, $70, $80,000, because a pre-existing condition, well, that's anybody.
Yeah.
And that's a real change, and I think that's why we're going to win this thing.
Well, look, I would like to do this again with you all. I know you all are hopefully not tired of, but are accustomed to hearing from us as to asking for ideas and help. We're going to continue that, but I think part of what the responsibility of my responsibilities in this task force is to communicate more broadly, not only within the government but outside the government, what it is we're trying to do. And it is not merely, which is critical, to provide for and set up a circumstance where there's a new foundation, that there are good paying, decent jobs that people can aspire to and get and keep and aren't likely to be exported. But beyond that, there are a whole range of things from, you know, if you gave a parent a choice in that category you're talking about, Jim, you gave parents a choice between having a $15,000 increase in their salary or health care bill that protects them, a real student loan program that was not going to drive them into extreme debt, an ability to have flexibility in the workplace to make choices when they have very conflicting and difficult family issues to deal with. My guess is most would pick the latter and not the former, because you get a lot more than, in terms of your quality of life, than an additional $15,000. And so I think we have to raise, I have to raise, the president wants to raise these other issues that go beyond just the wage, which is obviously critically important. And that's what we're trying to put together. My objective here is to have a package of attainable, sustainable suggestions, some of administratively be able to accomplish, some of it requiring legislation, some of it just, raising the consciousness of everyone from business to labor to average Americans is the kind of things that they should be asking for, that are appropriate, that could change, again, their quality of life. But I really appreciate it. I wish this were longer, because I think we could effectively, go to lunch and come back and spend the whole afternoon doing this. But if I don't go to lunch, I'm in trouble. So I thank you all very, very much for being here, and thank you. Continue
Thank you very
to
much.
appreciate it. Thanks.